Hey there, Vital. Welcome back to Squamish. Today we are chatting about the Alchemy Arktos 150. And for me, this was an exciting review because right around a year ago, I had the chance to test the older version of this bike. And even though it had a little bit less travel, this version is essentially replacing that one. And you know, a year ago when I wrote that review, I saw a lot of real potential with this suspension system and with this brand, but there was still a few gaps that needed to be made up. So when this thing landed on my doorstep earlier this spring, I was really excited to get this thing built up. This review for me was really about the comparison between old and new. And as a reviewer, what I really enjoy, or one of the things I really enjoy, is testing these incremental updates from one generation of a bike to the next and seeing if those small, minute changes actually make for a big difference in feel on the trail. The first thing that kind of struck me was that Alchemy has gone and taken this Artkos design and applied it in 3 different travel configurations, as well as full 2.9 and mullet offerings. In all 3 cases, regardless of rear wheel size, you have almost identical frames by appearance only, but with kinematics and geometry designed for an intended use. The biggest change on paper anyhow is the updated geometry numbers. And for me, this was a big deal because with the old version, the geometry just was not up to par. And as a result, I actually really struggled to ride the other bike well. And so for me, seeing the updated geometry numbers even before this bike arrived, I felt like I was going to be able to really get a different sense with this new bike. So in terms of updated geometry, the 2 biggest differences that were immediately apparent when I hopped on this bike were the lengthened reach and the lowered stack height of this updated model compared to the old model. This instantly made a dramatic difference for me on the trail. As soon as I hopped on this bike, I was comfortable and I knew that this review and this outcome was going to be significantly different from the previous. The Artkos features the Sine suspension system. This suspension system is a dual short link design, and just above the bottom bracket is what's known as a baby link. And this baby link controls the kinematics of the bike's travel as it cycles. And so what we've got here is we've got a regressive initial stroke, a progressive mid-stroke, and a regressive end stroke. And what that really provides and what that feels like on the trail is initially this bike is quite supple off the top. Mid-stroke is supportive, so it's kind of pumpy and playful, and I'm able to, you know, pop and jib around and change lines relatively effortlessly. And then at the end stroke, rather than sort of ramping up really aggressively and feeling like I was hitting a wall, I was able to use full travel on the bike. And while I didn't need to, I could have always added volume spacers to that rear shock if I needed something more progressive. In my case, I left this thing bone stock, was able to use full travel, and never felt like I was hitting a wall, other than the odd scenario where I made a mistake or you're hitting something that you just expect any bike to bottom out. Now, what I like about this suspension system is that it's really, really versatile. That's the word that really comes to mind for me when I describe this bike, is the versatility of the Artkos 150. Now, having tested a number of other long travel and enduro bikes, there are lots of bikes where I instantly just point towards the most fall-line trails because the bikes sort of tend to feel like battleships on low angle or moderate terrain, whereas this Artkos 150 actually was a lot of fun in just about every trail riding scenario. And even though it's got a 170 mil Fox 38 up front and 150 mils of travel in the rear, this bike actually pedals and feels much, much lighter, which is great. You know, it allowed me to use this bike in a much broader sense than many other enduro bikes, where, as I said, if they're not pointed downhill with a whole bunch of momentum behind them, they're just no fun to ride. And so what this bike really is intended for, in my eyes, is it's intended for, you know, the self-propelled enduro racer. And what I mean by that is the riders who maybe live in areas where there isn't quite as much elevation gain, elevation lost, and terrain is a little bit more rolling than compared to a place like Squamish, where it's essentially straight up followed by straight down, and you really need sort of a bike that can basically just eat holes and compressions and basically trail noise the whole way down. What this bike did really, really well, in my opinion, is that this bike handled kind of the more moderate terrain that we have around here as well, even the cross-country terrain that we have around here. This bike was still a real treat to ride, where, like I said, there are some other 150 mil bikes that, in truth, they're just no fun to ride on anything other than really, really aggressive terrain. So what Alchemy has done really well, in my opinion, with this bike is they've struck a really nice balance between a bike that is capable, but a bike that is also kind of a treat to ride, a treat to climb in just about every single scenario. So from a part spec standpoint, I like a lot of the choices that Alchemy has made here with this bike. Great suspension first and foremost. And on top of that, we've got an Industry 9 Enduro wheel set. Obviously, the hubs don't really need an introduction at this point. The aluminum rims did their job throughout the test. I didn't have to put these wheels into a truing stand. And even though I had lighter casing tires that came on this build, all the dings and knocks that these rims take is actually quite impressive. You know, there's no real signs of abuse. They're still holding air, and the couple of small dings that I did put in the rear wheel, you know, they would have happened with any other wheel set. It was really just my mistake taking bad lines. On top of that, you've got a SRAM drivetrain, and you've got code brakes. And now you can debate about which drivetrain manufacturer is best, but again, for me, this SRAM drivetrain just did its job. No complaints. When I smacked the derailleur off of something, I was able just to adjust it slightly and keep on rolling. The code brakes were plenty of stopping power for me. And then beyond that, what Alchemy has done is, rather than sort of trying to cut cost on cockpit parts or saddles or things like that, they've actually spec'd the whole bike really, really nicely. So this bike isn't just sort of a boutique frame with good suspension and then more affordable parts. It's top shelf from front to back. And so for riders who sort of demand, you know, the best of the best across the board, you know, you really can't argue with any of the components on this bike. And certainly after my experience, I have no arguments about this build. And what's nice is that all the build levels actually come with this same suspension. So you're going to get the same great performing chassis no matter what build you choose. The real differences are just in the drivetrain, which is splitting hairs at the end of the day, and really just comes down to budget. Well, to be honest, first and foremost, I think Alchemy deserves some credit for just how much they've improved this bike compared to the previous generation. I really enjoyed my time riding this bike and really had no complaints. You know, I think that, you know, the bike held up well, the parts held up well, it performed really, really well on the trail. This new version, I can get a bottle cage inside the front triangle, which may seem sort of petty, but at this day and age as well, it's almost a necessity for a trail rider. Otherwise, you're either carrying a pack all the time or it's sort of in a vulnerable position under the down tube. They've done a lot of really, really good things with this bike. I think Alchemy, with this suspension design, with the direction they've gone with this bike, they've really pushed things in a great direction. And I think this bike deserves a look from a lot of riders, especially those, like I said, who are sort of, you know, self-propelled enduro racers or riders who just kind of want that one long travel bike, but they still love to pedal, still love to put in long days, still love to ride cross country, and they might still take it to the odd enduro race, maybe the odd day on a chairlift or doing shuttles. This bike is a great bike for those riders. If you're looking for a battleship that's just going to run over everything in its path, there are better options out there with, you know, longer wheelbases, more travel, so on and so forth. But in truth, you know, for me, as sort of, you know, I would describe myself as a, you know, as a self-propelled trail rider who just likes to put in big miles and ride just about anything. A bike like this is actually a really, really nice fit for kind of my personal preference. And you know, and lastly, the one thing I really got to take my hat off to is the Sine suspension system. I think this suspension design, you know, really has a lot of potential. It worked really, really well here in Squamish, British Columbia, and in truth, if it works well here, I think it's going to probably work well in most places.